The wind was a living thing, a malevolent spirit clawing at the solitary cabin perched on the high mountain pass, its howl a symphony of desolation that Elias knew too well. Snow, thick as a shroud, had been falling for 3 days, burying the world, burying memories he fought to keep interred. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth spat and crackled, a defiant heart beating against the icy siege. Elias, a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape as the mountains themselves, sat at a rough-hewn table, his hands, gnarled as old timber, wrapped around a chipped mug of weak coffee. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, were fixed on the flames, but he saw other fires, other winters. He saw a woman smile, heard a child's laughter, ghosts that danced just beyond the firelight, always just out of reach. The loneliness was a familiar cloak, heavy but threadbare in places where the cold seeped through, chilling him deeper than the blizzard ever could. He'd chosen this life, or perhaps it had chosen him, after the world had taken everything else. Here, the silence was broken only by the wind and the crackle of wood, a predictable sorrow he could manage. Then came the sound, almost swallowed by the gale, faint, desperate. Knock. 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 Elias froze, his head snapping up. It couldn't be. No one came this high, not in this weather. Not anymore. He strained his ears. The wind mocked him, shrieking, tearing at the shutters. Perhaps it was a branch, or ice falling from the eaves. He settled back, his heart a cold stone in his chest. Then again, louder this time, more insistent, laced with a terrifying fragility. Knock. 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 There was no mistaking it. Someone was out there. Someone was dying. A tremor ran through him, not of fear, but of a deeper, older pain. He didn't want this. He didn't want to open that door to whatever suffering lay beyond. His small, precarious peace was too precious. But the image of his wife, Sarah, her face pale in the grip of the fever that had stolen her, her hand reaching for him, flashed in his mind. He'd been helpless then. He pushed himself up, the chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. Each step to the door was a battle. He unlatched it, the heavy wood groaning in protest as he pulled it inward against the wind's fury. A blast of snow and ice assailed him, stinging his face. And there, collapsing into the doorway, was a figure, a woman, so caked in snow she seemed sculpted from it. She was a wraith, her clothes torn, thin, offering no protection against the mountain's wrath. In her arms, clutched to her chest like a final, desperate hope, was a bundle. A child. The woman's eyes, wild with terror and exhaustion, met his for a fleeting second before fluttering closed. A soft moan escaped her lips, a sound of utter surrender. Elias felt a chasm open within him. Not again. Please, not again. But the plea died unspoken. He saw the blue tinge on her lips, the frost on her eyelashes. He saw the small, still form in her arms. The rescuer in him, the man he thought long dead, stirred. He moved with the grim efficiency of one accustomed to harsh realities. He scooped her up, surprised at her lightness, the cold seeping through his own layers. The child, a girl no older than 3 or 4, whimpered, a tiny, heartbreaking sound. He carried them inside, kicking the door shut against the raging storm. The sudden silence of the cabin, broken only by their ragged breaths and the fire's steady song, was profound. He laid the woman gently on the worn rug before the hearth, her head lolling. The child, he realized, was barely breathing. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to engulf him. He fought it down. He carefully unwrapped the girl from the layers of thin, damp cloth. Her skin was icy. He stripped off her wet clothes, his fingers clumsy with haste, and wrapped her in the driest, warmest blanket he owned, one Sarah had knitted long ago. He chafed her tiny hands and feet, whispering hoarsely, "Come on, little one. Breathe. You gotta breathe." He turned his attention to the woman. Her pulse was thready, her breathing shallow. He worked methodically, removing her frozen garments, his touch impersonal yet gentle, covering her with more blankets. He stoked the fire, adding logs until it blazed, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. The cabin was small, a single room, but it was a fortress against the storm, a sanctuary. He didn't know who they were, or what horrors they were fleeing, but in this moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the fragile flicker of life in these two broken beings. Hours passed in a blur of tending to them, forcing sips of warm broth between the woman's lips when she stirred, checking the child's breathing, adding wood to the fire. He moved like an automaton, his own exhaustion, his own ghosts, held at bay by the immediacy of the crisis. The woman's name, he would later learn, was Lyra. The child's, Ilara. But for now, they were just survivors, washed up on the desolate shore of his existence, and he, against all his instincts for self-preservation, had become their reluctant harbor. The wind howled outside, but inside, a fragile warmth began to spread, not just from the fire, but from a place Elias thought had turned to ash long ago. He watched them, the mother and child, huddled together under the blankets, their faces pale in the firelight, and a single, unfamiliar thought surfaced: maybe this time, he wouldn't be helpless. Maybe this time, he could save them. He was careful not to crowd them, aware that his presence, large and unfamiliar, might be a source of fear rather than comfort for the woman. The child, Ilara, responded more readily to warmth and the gentle coaxing of broth he managed to get her to sip. Her small coughs were less ragged now, her breathing a little easier. The woman, Lyra, remained mostly unconscious, stirring only to moan softly or to instinctively pull the blankets tighter around herself and the child. Elias found himself watching them, a strange ache in his chest. They were so vulnerable, so utterly dependent on him. It was a responsibility he hadn't sought, one that dredged up painful memories of his own failures, his own losses. He remembered Sarah's increasingly frail form, Tom's small hand clutching his, the bitter cold of that other, fateful winter. He shook his head, trying to dispel the ghosts. These two were alive. That was all that mattered now. He kept the fire roaring, the cabin becoming almost oppressively warm, but he knew it was necessary to combat the deep chill that had settled into their bones. He found some of Sarah's old clothes packed away in a wooden chest, a simple woolen dress, some undergarments. They would be too big for Lyra, but they were clean and dry. He laid them out near the hearth, hoping she would find them when she was able. The first night passed in a tense vigil. Elias dozed fitfully in his chair, his ears attuned to every breath, every sigh from the rug before the fire. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, its relentless assault a constant reminder of the fragility of their shelter, of life itself. He thought of the vast, empty wilderness surrounding them, a place that could swallow people whole, leaving no trace. How had they even made it this far? What desperate circumstances had driven them out into such a tempest? The questions gnawed at him, but he pushed them away. Answers could wait. Survival came first. Lyra woke to warmth, a sensation so alien it was disorienting. Her eyelids were heavy, crusted. A soft crackling sound reached her ears, rhythmic, comforting. She tried to move, a groan escaping her chapped lips. Pain, dull and aching, radiated through her body. Panic flared, sharp and cold, as memory returned in jagged shards, the endless running, the biting cold, the gnawing hunger, the terror of pursuit. Ilara. Where was Ilara? Her eyes flew open. She was lying on a soft fur rug, a thick blanket covering her. A fire blazed in a stone hearth nearby, its golden light painting the rough wooden walls of a small cabin. And beside her, nestled under the same blanket, sleeping soundly, was Ilara, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Relief washed over Lyra, so potent it left her weak. She reached out a trembling hand, touching Ilara's cheek. Warm. She was warm. A man sat in a chair across the small room, his back partially to them, mending something with a needle and thick thread. He was large, his shoulders broad, his presence filling the space. He wore simple, worn clothes. His stillness was absolute, like a mountain. Lyra tensed, every instinct screaming danger. Who was he? Where were they? The men who hunted them, had he found them for them? She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down. The movement, slight as it was, caught his attention. He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers. They were grey, like the winter sky, and held a deep, unreadable weariness. He said nothing, merely looked at her, his expression unchanging. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. She pulled Ilara closer, a protective arm instinctively curving around her daughter. Her throat was dry, her voice lost somewhere in the frozen wasteland she had traversed. The man rose, not abruptly, but with a deliberate slowness that was oddly reassuring. He approached the hearth, picked up a tin mug from the mantelpiece, and ladled something warm from a pot simmering over the flames. He walked towards her, extending the mug. Lyra flinched, pressing herself further into the rug. His eyes softened, just a fraction. "Broth," he said, his voice low, rough, like stone shifting. "Good for you." For the little 1 inch he placed the mug on the floor near her, then retreated to his chair, resuming his mending. His actions were devoid of threat, yet Lyra remained coiled, a spring wound tight with fear. For days, this silent ballet continued. Elias, she had heard him murmur the name once when he thought she slept, a soft sound addressed to no one, moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency. He tended the fire, brought them food, water. He never pressed her, never asked questions. He would leave small portions of cooked rabbit or stewed berries near them, then return to his own tasks, chopping wood outside, checking his snares, always within sight of the cabin but giving them space. His silence was a strange comfort. The men who had pursued her were never silent. Their voices, their laughter, had been weapons. This man's quiet was a shield. Ilara, with the innocent resilience of childhood, was the first to thaw. After a few days, her fear began to recede, replaced by a child's natural curiosity. She would watch Elias with wide, solemn eyes as he whittled a piece of wood or cleaned his old rifle. One morning, while Lyra drifted in a restless, pain-filled sleep, Ilara, drawn by the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of Elias' carving, toddled over to him. Lyra woke with a start, her breath catching in her throat, to see Ilara standing beside Elias's chair, her tiny hand tentatively reaching for a wood shaving. Elias had frozen, the knife still in his hand. He looked at Ilara, then at Lyra, his expression unreadable. Lyra's heart pounded. But Elias simply put down his knife and the piece of wood. He picked up a finished carving from the mantel, a small, smooth bird, and held it out to Ilara. Ilara looked at it, then at him, then took it carefully in her small fist, a tiny smile touching her lips. Elias's gaze flickered to Lyra, a silent question in his eyes. Lyra found she could breathe again. She offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first crack in the wall of her distrust. The cabin became their world. The storm raged outside for what felt like an eternity, sealing them in. Inside, the fire was a constant, a warm, beating heart. Elias would sometimes sit by it, staring into the flames, and Lyra would see a profound sadness etch itself onto his weathered features. She wondered about his story, his solitude. He was a man haunted, she sensed, much like herself. She began to notice the small details, the way he always made sure the woodbox was full before nightfall, the gentleness with which he handled the small bird carving before giving it to Ilara, the worn photograph of a woman and a small boy tucked into a crack in the wooden mantel, their faces faded with time. Scars. They both had them, visible and invisible. His were etched on his hands, his face, testament to a hard life. Hers were branded on her soul, raw and bleeding. Slowly, Lyra started to heal, physically at least. The frostbite on her fingers and toes receded, the gnawing ache in her bones lessened. She ate the food Elias provided, simple fare, but nourishing. She started to help, in small ways. Folding the blankets. Stirring the stew when he was outside. These small acts were a language of their own, tentative steps towards an unspoken understanding. She still didn't speak, not with words. The trauma had stolen her voice, or perhaps she had willingly surrendered it, a desperate attempt to become invisible to those who hunted her. But her eyes started to lose some of their haunted look. When Elias met her gaze now, she didn't always flinch away. The fire crackled. Ilara babbled softly, playing with her wooden bird. Elias mended a tear in his worn coat. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the small cabin, a fragile piece, as delicate as a newborn fawn, was taking its first, uncertain steps. It was a sanctuary built on shared silence, on unspoken grief, and the quiet, steady beat of a rescuer's unexpected kindness. Lyra found Sarah's clothes, neatly folded. She held the woolen dress to her cheek. It smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke, a scent of a life she couldn't imagine. Wearing it felt like borrowing someone else's skin, but it was warm, and her own clothes were little more than rags. Elias made no comment when he saw her in it, but she thought she saw a flicker of something deep in his eyes, a sorrow too profound for words, before he turned away. The days bled into weeks, marked by the slow retreat of the snow and the gradual lengthening of the daylight that filtered through the cabin's single, small window. A fragile rhythm established itself within the weathered walls. Elias would rise before dawn, the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee his daily ritual. Lyra, now stronger, would tend to Ilara, her movements becoming less hesitant, more assured. She started to contribute more meaningfully to their shared existence, her hands, though still bearing the memory of frostbite, relearning forgotten domestic skills. She would mend Ilara's tattered clothes with thread Elias provided, her stitches neat and precise. She learned to bank the fire, to prepare the simple meals they shared, her presence in the small kitchen area no longer that of a frightened ghost but of a quiet partner. Elias watched her, his expressions usually unreadable, but Lyra sometimes caught a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or a reluctant acknowledgement of her growing strength. He saw the fierce, unwavering devotion she had for Ilara, a mother's love that mirrored the raw ache in his own heart for the family he had lost. That shared understanding, unspoken yet profound, began to weave a delicate thread between them. He never asked about her past, about the fear that still clung to her like a shroud, manifesting in nightmares that would leave her trembling and gasping in the pre-dawn darkness. He would simply ensure the fire was burning bright, a silent sentinel against the terrors of the night. One afternoon, Ilara, chasing a dust mote dancing in a rare shaft of sunlight, stumbled and fell, striking her head against the corner of the rough-hewn table. Her cry was sharp, full of pain and surprise. Lyra was there in an instant, scooping her up, her face a mask of terror. "Ilara!" "Oh, my sweet girl," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse, the first word she had spoken beyond Ilara's name in weeks. Elias, who had been sharpening an axe by the door, was by their side immediately. He gently examined the small bump already forming on Ilara's forehead. "Just a knock," he said, his voice calm, steady. "She'll be all right." He fetched a clean cloth, dipped it in cool water from the bucket, and showed Lyra how to hold it against the swelling. His competence, his quiet reassurance in that moment of panic, chipped away another piece of Lyra's fear. Later that evening, as Ilara slept peacefully between them, her small face angelic in the firelight, Lyra spoke again. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, directed at Elias who was oiling his rifle. He paused, looking at her. He simply nodded, a gesture that conveyed more than words could. The dam of her silence was slowly breaking. A few days later, as a pale spring sun finally began to melt the last stubborn patches of snow around the cabin, Elias was checking his perimeter, a habit ingrained from years of solitude and a recent, growing unease. He found it nestled at the base of a pine tree, half hidden by new growth, a small, metallic cylinder, cold to the touch, with no discernible markings. It wasn't from this world, not his world of wood and stone and snow. It was alien, manufactured, and it sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the lingering winter air. He knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in his gut, that it was a marker, a beacon. They were being tracked. He said nothing to Lyra, not wanting to shatter the fragile peace she was beginning to find. But his vigilance increased. His eye scanned the tree line more frequently, his hand often resting on the worn stock of the rifle that leaned near the door. Lyra noticed the change in him, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze lingered on the horizon. It reawakened her own dormant fears. The nightmares returned with greater intensity, filled with faceless men in dark uniforms, their voices cold, their eyes empty as they called her Asset LX7. She would wake up gasping, Ilara stirring beside her, her small hand reaching for comfort. One morning, after a particularly harrowing night, Lyra found Elias staring at the faded photograph on the mantel. He touched it gently, his calloused finger tracing the outline of the woman's smiling face. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "My wife." And little Tom, he didn't look at Lyra, just continued to stare at the photograph. The fever took them. Winter like this one, years ago. Lyra's heart ached for him. She understood loss. She understood grief. She reached out, her hand hesitating before lightly touching his arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He turned then, his grey eyes filled with a profound sadness, but also a flicker of something else, gratitude, perhaps, for her shared sorrow. He covered her hand with his own for a brief moment. "Stay," he said, his voice rough. "You and the little one. Stay as long as you need. You're safe here." The word safe hung in the air, a promise, a hope. But even as he said it, the image of the metallic cylinder flashed in his mind. Safety was a fragile thing, easily shattered. He knew the whispers of her past were growing louder, drawing closer, and soon, the sanctuary he had offered would be tested. Ilara, too, was growing accustomed to Elias's quiet presence. She would sometimes offer him one of her precious berries, or pat his rough hand with her tiny one. These small gestures chipped away at the wall Elias had built around his heart, stone by stone. He found himself carving more little animals for her, a deer, a bear, a clumsy-looking rabbit that made Ilara giggle, a sound that was like sunlight after a long winter. Each giggle, each small smile, was a balm to his old wounds, though he would never have admitted it, even to himself. He began to teach Lyra, through actions rather than words, how to set simple snares, how to identify edible plants now emerging from the thawing earth. She was a quick learner, her desperation to provide for Ilara a powerful motivator. He recognized her resilience, the steel core beneath her fragile exterior. It reminded him of Sarah in a way that was both painful and comforting. The cabin, once a tomb of his memories, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, coming back to life. The air grew heavy in the days that followed, thick with unspoken anxieties. Spring was unfurling its tentative green fingers across the mountainside, yet a chill deeper than winter's lingered around the cabin. Elias patrolled the perimeter with increasing frequency, his rifle a near-constant companion. He found another metallic cylinder, then a third, each one closer than the last, like a tightening noose. He knew they were coming. Lyra, attuned to his grim watchfulness, felt her old terrors resurface, coiling in her stomach like cold serpents. The fragile sense of security she had painstakingly built began to crumble. She clung to Ilara, her love for her daughter a fierce, protective fire against the encroaching darkness. She found herself speaking more, her voice gaining strength, as if the act of naming her fears, even just to herself in hushed whispers, gave her some small measure of control. She told Elias snippets of her past, fragmented and disjointed, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting a horrifying landscape. She spoke of sterile facilities, of cold, impersonal beings she called a handlers, of a life where she was not a person but a possession, valued only for a rare genetic marker Ilara had inherited. She had escaped with her daughter, seeking not freedom, for she didn't know if such a thing truly existed for them, but simply a chance for Ilara to live, to breathe air untainted by their pursuers' sterile control. Elias listened, his face impassive, but his eyes held a simmering anger that mirrored her own. He didn't offer platitudes or false reassurances. He simply listened, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of her memories. One dawn, the birdsong was abruptly cut short. An unnatural silence descended upon the forest, a silence that prickled the skin. Elias, already awake, was standing by the window, his silhouette rigid. "They're here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, but Lyra heard the steely resolve beneath. Her blood ran cold. She scrambled up, pulling Ilara, still sleepy and confused, into her arms. Fear, stark and primal, threatened to paralyze her. But then she saw Elias's face. He turned from the window, and in his eyes, she saw not fear, but a grim determination. He was a man preparing for battle, not for himself, but for them. That look, that unwavering strength, ignited a spark within her. She would not cower. She would not let them take Ilara. Not again. 3 figures emerged from the tree line, moving with an unnerving, synchronized grace. They wore dark, nondescript uniforms that seemed to absorb the pale morning light. Their faces were obscured by visored helmets, rendering them impersonal, inhuman. The trackers. They stopped a short distance from the cabin, their movements precise, economical. One of them, slightly taller than the others, stepped forward. A synthesized voice, devoid of inflection, cut through the quiet air. Asset LX7. You will relinquish the child, unit designation ELR4. Resistance is futile. Lyra clutched Ilara tighter, her knuckles white. Asset. Unit. Not mother. Not child. Elias stepped out of the cabin, positioning himself between the trackers and the door. His old rifle was held loosely in his hands, but his stance was anything but casual. She's not an asset, Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. She's a woman. And this is her home. You're not welcome here. The lead tracker tilted its head, a gesture that was somehow more menacing than any overt threat. This does not concern you, civilian. Step aside, it concerns me, Elias stated, his gaze unwavering. They stay with me, inside. Lyra watched, her heart pounding. The old instinct to flee, to hide, warred with a new, unfamiliar courage. Elias was standing against them, for them. He was one man against 3, against a force she knew to be ruthless and technologically superior. She looked down at Ilara, at her innocent face, her trusting eyes. And she knew she couldn't just watch. She had to do something. The lead tracker raised a hand, and the other 2 fanned out, their movements fluid, predatory. Final warning, civilian. Elias didn't flinch. You'll have to go through me. The confrontation was swift, brutal, and almost silent. The trackers moved with disciplined speed, but Elias knew this land, every rock, every tree. He used the terrain to his advantage, his movements honed by years of survival. It wasn't a firefight in the traditional sense. The trackers seemed to favor incapacitation over outright lethality, their weapons emitting brief, high-pitched whines. One of them lunged at Elias. He sidestepped, bringing the butt of his rifle up in a powerful arc, catching the tracker under the chin. The figure stumbled back, momentarily disoriented. But another was already moving, flanking him. Suddenly, a piercing scream ripped through the air. Not from Ilara, but from Lyra. She burst from the cabin, a burning log held precariously in her hands, its end glowing fiercely. Leave him alone, she shrieked, her voice raw with desperation and fury. She thrust the burning log towards the tracker advancing on Elias's blind side. The tracker, surprised by her sudden appearance and the primitive weapon, recoiled, shielding its visor from the heat and sparks. The momentary distraction was all Elias needed. He whirled, his rifle speaking once, a deafening roar that echoed through the mountains. It wasn't a killing shot, but it struck the tracker's weapon, sending it spinning away. The lead tracker, seeing its advantage waning, its targets proving more resilient than anticipated, made a decisive move towards the cabin door, towards Ilara. The child, its synthesized voice commanded. Lyra screamed again, dropping the log and throwing herself in front of the doorway, a desperate, human shield. Elias saw the red glint of a targeting laser appear on Lyra's chest. There was no time. He lunged, tackling Lyra and himself to the ground, just as a searing beam of energy shot past where she had stood, charring the door frame. He rolled, coming up on one knee, and fired again. This time, his aim was true. The lead tracker staggered, its movements becoming erratic, before collapsing heavily to the ground, systems failing. The remaining tracker, seeing its leader fall and facing 2 unexpectedly fierce opponents, paused. Its helmeted head swiveled between Elias and the fallen leader. Then, with the same unnerving efficiency it had displayed upon arrival, it turned and retreated back into the trees, disappearing as silently as it had come. Silence descended again, broken only by Lyra's ragged sobs and Elara's frightened whimpers from inside the cabin. Elias rose slowly, his body aching, his ears ringing. He looked at Lyra, who was pushing herself up, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and triumph. She had found her voice. She had found her strength. She had fought. He moved quickly to the fallen tracker, ensuring it was truly disabled, its strange technology beyond his full comprehension but clearly inoperative. The forest was eerily quiet now, the echo of the rifle shot fading into the vastness of the mountains. He felt a deep weariness settle over him, the adrenaline ebbing away, leaving behind an ache in his muscles and a tremor in his hands. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom of adrenaline and shock. Elias quickly checked the fallen tracker. It was inert, its systems fried, no longer a threat. The other had vanished, but he knew it wasn't necessarily over. They might send more. But for now, for this moment, they were safe. He turned back to Lyra, who was now inside, kneeling beside a terrified Elara, murmuring soft reassurances. Lyra looked up as he entered, her eyes still wide, but a new light shone within them, the fierce glow of a protector. He saw a shallow burn mark on her arm where the energy beam had grazed past. "You're hurt," he said, his voice rougher than usual. She glanced at it, almost dismissively. "It's nothing," but he insisted, his concern overriding her stoicism. He gently cleaned the wound, his touch surprisingly tender, applying a salve he kept for burns. Their roles were subtly reversed. She, the one who had needed so much care, now bore a wound in his defense, and he, the stoic rescuer, tended to her with an open gentleness she hadn't seen before. As he worked, their eyes met. In that shared glance, unspoken volumes passed between them, gratitude, respect, a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger. The fear was still there, a lingering tremor in the air, but something else was present too, a burgeoning hope, tentative yet resilient. Elara, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, crawled into Lyra's lap and then reached a small hand towards Elias, patting his cheek. A fragile smile touched Elias's lips, chasing away some of the grimness. The cabin, which had so recently been a battleground, began to feel like a sanctuary once more. The charred doorframe was a stark reminder of the violence, but inside, the fire still burned, a symbol of their enduring will. That evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they sat together, not speaking much, but enveloped in a comfortable quiet. The threat had been faced, not by him alone, but by them, together. Lyra had found a strength she didn't know she possessed, a roar to match her fierce love for her child. Elias looked at her, at the way the firelight softened the tired lines on her face, at the determined set of her jaw. He thought of the empty spaces in his life, the silence that had once been filled with Sarah's laughter and Tom's childish chatter. For years, he had guarded those spaces, keeping them sacrosanct, barren. But now, Lyra and Elara were here, filling the cabin not just with their presence, but with a warmth that was slowly, undeniably, thawing the ice around his heart. He reached out, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the table. She looked at him, her eyes questioning, a little fearful still, but also hopeful. "Lyra," he began, his voice quiet, hesitant. He wasn't a man of easy words. He thought of all the things he wanted to say, of the future he hadn't dared to imagine until now. He remembered the title he'd seen in a forgotten, dog-eared book from his past, a romantic notion he'd once scoffed at, but now felt profoundly true. He leaned closer, his voice a low whisper, meant only for her, a promise against the vast, listening silence of the mountains. "Stay," he breathed, the word carrying the weight of all his unspoken emotions. "Stay with me. With Elara. Forever. This can be your home." Our home, tears welled in Lyra's eyes, spilling over, tracing paths down her soot-stained cheeks. Not tears of sorrow, or fear, but of an overwhelming, unexpected joy. She had been hunted, a fugitive with no hope, no future. She had arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back and a child to protect. And now, this quiet, haunted cowboy, this reluctant savior, was offering her everything: safety, belonging, a family. A home. Her voice, when she finally found it, was thick with emotion. "Yes," she whispered back, her hand turning to grip his tightly. "Yes." Elara, sensing the profound shift, looked from her mother's tear-streaked face to Elias's softened expression, and a wide, happy smile spread across her own. She scrambled from Lyra's lap and launched herself into Elias's arms, hugging him tightly around the neck. He held her close, his eyes meeting Lyra's over Elara's small head. And in that moment, surrounded by the scent of wood smoke and the quiet crackle of the fire, a new family was born, unconventional yet fiercely bound, their foundations laid in shared trauma, mutual protection, and the courageous, life-affirming whisper of stay. The scars of their pasts would always remain, not as marks of damage, but as testaments to their survival, to the battles they had fought and won. The future was still an unknown territory, the threat of the trackers perhaps not entirely extinguished. But they would face it together. The cabin on the mountain, once a symbol of Elias's isolation and grief, transformed. It became a place of laughter, of learning, of shared meals and quiet evenings. Elara's bright chatter filled the spaces once occupied by sorrowful silence. Lyra's quiet strength blossomed, her hands now tending a small garden, her voice sometimes lifting in a soft, forgotten song. Elias, the solitary cowboy, found himself a father again, a partner, his heart, once frozen, now beating with a steady, hopeful rhythm. He taught Elara about the mountains, about the stars, and Lyra taught him, in her own quiet way, how to let joy back into the scarred landscape of his soul. They had found their sanctuary, not in a place, but in each other. What does home truly mean to you? Is it the walls that surround you, or the people who make you feel seen, safe, and loved? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story of courage, resilience, and the power of found family touched your heart, please leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales that explore the depths of human connection and the enduring light of hope.